Surviving the Collapse, the story of a resilient community. As the sun rose over the desolate landscape, two figures emerged from the wreckage of what was once a bustling city. Sarah and David had been traveling together for months, ever since the world as they knew it had ended. Sarah was a tough, resourceful woman in her late 20s, with short, dark hair and piercing blue eyes. She had been a nurse before the apocalypse, and her medical skills had saved both her and David's lives on more than one occasion. David was a quiet, reserved man in his early 30s, with messy brown hair and a scruffy beard. He had been a software engineer before the world ended, and his quick thinking and problem-solving skills had proved invaluable in their journey. Together, they made an unlikely pair, thrown together by circumstance and the shared desire to survive. They had seen things that most people couldn't even imagine. Entire cities reduced to rubble, streets filled with the corpses of the infected, and mutated creatures that defied explanation. But despite the horrors they had witnessed, Sarah and David had managed to keep their humanity intact. They still believed in the power of kindness and compassion, and they still held on to the hope that they would one day find a way to rebuild the world they had lost. As they walked through the ruins of the city, Sarah and David remained vigilant, scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. They had learned the hard way that in this new world, the only thing they could count on was each other. And so, with the weight of the world on their shoulders and the hope of a better future in their hearts, Sarah and David set off into the unknown, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Chapter 1. The Beginning of the End. It was a cough that started it all. At first, people dismissed it as just another bug going around, but the cough persisted, turning into a fever that left its victims weak and delirious. Then came the rashes, the vomiting, and the blood. It was clear that this was something new, something far more deadly than... And so, with nothing but each other to rely on, Sarah and David set out into the unknown, ready to face whatever horrors lay ahead. They knew that the road would be long and difficult, that they would face unimaginable challenges along the way. But they also knew that they had each other, and that as long as they had hope, they could make it through anything. Chapter 2. The New World. Sarah and David had been traveling for weeks. Sarah and David were welcomed into the community with open arms, grateful to have found a place where they could rest and regroup. For the first time since the outbreak began, they felt like they had a chance at building a new life for themselves. But the respite was short-lived. One day, the community was attacked by a group of bandits who had heard about their supplies and decided to take them by force. The bandits were armed and dangerous. Their suspicions were confirmed when Max was caught stealing supplies from the community. It turned out that he wasn't a survivor at all. He was a spy, sent by a rival group to gather information about their defenses. Sarah and David decided to investigate, determined to uncover any potential threats to their safety. They talked to their friends in the community, asking if they had noticed anything suspicious. Slowly but surely, they began to piece together a disturbing picture of what was going on. It turned out that there was a group within the community that was planning to stage a coup, overthrowing the current leaders and taking control themselves. They believed that the current leaders were not doing enough to keep the community safe, and that they needed to take matters into their own hands. Sarah and David were horrified by this news. They had always believed in the strength of the community, and the idea that some members were willing to turn against each other was deeply unsettling. They knew that they had to do something to stop this group before they could cause any harm. They began to gather evidence, talking to as many people as they could and trying to figure out who was involved in the plot. It wasn't easy. The conspirators were being very careful not to reveal their plans to anyone outside of their group. But slowly, in the end, the coup was thwarted, and the leaders of the community were able to restore order. But the whole experience had left a bitter taste in everyone's mouth. The community had once again been rocked by betrayal, and it was clear that the survivors were still struggling to come to terms with the new world they found themselves in. For Sarah and David, the experience had been a harsh reminder that in this new world, danger could come from anywhere. even from within their own community. But it had also shown them the importance of staying vigilant and working together to overcome the challenges they faced. They knew that they couldn't let their guard down, but they also knew that as long as they had each other, they could face whatever the future held. Chapter 5. A Desperate Search. Several months had passed since the attempted coup, and the community had settled back into a somewhat uneasy routine. Sarah and David had taken on more responsibility within the community, helping to ensure that everyone had enough food and water and that the perimeter was secure. But despite their efforts, it was clear that the survivors were still struggling. They were living in a world that was vastly different from the one they had known before, and every day brought new challenges and dangers. One of the biggest challenges was the search for other survivors. The community had grown to a size that was sustainable, but they knew that they couldn't rely on their own resources forever. They needed to find other groups of survivors, to trade goods and information, and to form alliances that would help them all to survive. Sarah and David were tasked with leading the search party. They set out into the wasteland, armed with supplies and weapons, and with a vague sense of hope that they might find other survivors. The journey was long and grueling. They had to navigate treacherous terrain, avoid dangerous creatures, and scavenge for food and water along the way. But they pressed on, driven by the knowledge that their community's survival depended on their success. Days turned into weeks, and still they found no sign of other survivors. They began to feel the weight of their isolation, the sense that they were the only ones left in a world that had been destroyed. It was a feeling that was both terrifying and exhilarating, and they struggled to hold on to their sense of purpose as the days wore on. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they came across a small group of survivors. They were ragged and weary, but their eyes lit up with hope when they saw Sarah and David's group. For a moment, it seemed like everything would be okay. They would form an alliance, share their resources, and work together to rebuild a better world. But then, they heard the news. The group of survivors had been attacked by a larger, more organized group. They had managed to fend them off, but just barely. They were on the run, constantly moving, constantly searching for safety. Sarah and David knew what they had to do. They couldn't leave these survivors to fend for themselves, not when they were facing the same dangers that they were. They convinced the survivors to join them, and they set out once again, searching for a safe haven where they could all live together in peace. It was a desperate search, and there were times when they thought they would never find what they were looking for. But they refused to give up, driven by a determination to survive in a world that seemed determined to destroy them. Finally, after weeks of searching, they found it. A small, isolated community that was willing to take them in. They were greeted with open arms, and for the first time in months, they felt a glimmer of hope for the future. But even as they settled into their new home, they knew that the challenges were far from over. There were still dangers lurking in the wasteland, still threats that they would have to face. But they were survivors, and they were determined to face whatever came their way, together. Chapter 6. Betrayal. The small community where Sarah, David, and the other survivors had found refuge was a welcome respite from the dangers of the wasteland. It was a place of relative safety, with walls to keep out the creatures that roamed the desolate landscape, and a group of people who were all working together to survive. For a while, it seemed like they had finally found some measure of peace. They worked hard to help the community grow and thrive, sharing their skills and knowledge with the other survivors. Sarah and David had taken on leadership roles, helping to organize the community and keep everyone safe. But as time went on, they began to notice that things were not as they seemed. There were whispers among the community, rumors of a group of people who were hoarding resources and manipulating others for their own gain. At first, Sarah and David tried to ignore these rumors, focusing on the work that needed to be done. But then, one day, they saw something that confirmed their worst fears. They were out on a supply run, searching for food and medicine to bring back to the community, when they stumbled upon a group of survivors who were clearly not from their community. They were armed and dangerous, and they were in the midst of a heated argument. At first, Sarah and David tried to stay hidden, observing from a distance. But then they heard something that made their blood run cold. One of the strangers was talking about the community where Sarah and David lived, about how easy it would be to take it over and claim all of their resources for themselves. Sarah and David knew that they had to act fast. They raced back to the community, warning everyone of the imminent danger. But it was too late. The group of outsiders had already infiltrated the community, and they had turned some of the survivors against Sarah, David, and their allies. In the chaos that followed, Sarah and David found themselves fighting for their lives. They were betrayed by people they had thought were their friends, attacked by strangers who saw them as nothing more than obstacles to be eliminated. It was a brutal battle, and the odds were against them. But Sarah and David refused to give up. They fought with everything they had, using their skills and training to protect the community they had worked so hard to build. In the end, they emerged victorious, but the cost was high. Many of their friends had been injured or killed, and the community was in shambles. Sarah and David were left to pick up the pieces, to try to rebuild what had been lost. But even as they worked to put the community back together, they knew that they could never let their guard down again. They had learned a hard lesson about the dangers of trust in a world that had been destroyed by betrayal and greed. And they were determined to do whatever it took to keep themselves and their community safe, no matter what challenges lay ahead. Chapter 7. The Stranger. After the betrayal and attack on their community, Sarah and David were more cautious than ever. They knew that they couldn't trust anyone outside of their small group, and they were always on the lookout for potential threats. One day, as they were out on a supply run, they came across a stranger. He was different from anyone they had met before. He was alone, with no weapons, and he seemed genuinely surprised to see them. At first, Sarah and David were skeptical. They had learned to be wary of strangers, and they didn't want to take any chances. But the man seemed harmless enough, and they decided to approach him cautiously. He introduced himself as Michael, and he explained that he had been traveling alone for months. He was a scavenger, like them, and he had been looking for a safe place to settle down. Sarah and David listened to Michael's story, and they couldn't help but feel a little bit of sympathy for him. They knew how hard it was to survive on your own in the wasteland, and they could see that Michael was exhausted and desperate for a place to call home. Against their better judgment, they decided to take Michael back to their community. They introduced him to the other survivors and tried to make him feel welcome. At first, everything seemed to be going well. Michael was helpful and friendly, and he seemed genuinely grateful to have found a safe place to stay. But as time went on, Sarah and David began to notice some strange things about Michael. He was always asking questions about their defenses, about their weapons and supplies. He was too curious, too interested in the details of their community. Sarah and David knew that something was off. They started to investigate Michael's past, trying to find out more about where he had come from and why he was so interested in their community. What they discovered was chilling. Michael wasn't who he claimed to be. He was a spy, sent by a group of raiders who wanted to take over their community and steal all of their resources. Sarah and David knew that they had to act fast. They couldn't let Michael leave and report back to his raiding party. They had to stop him before it was too late. In a tense showdown, Sarah and David confronted Michael. They told him what they had discovered, and they demanded that he leave their community and never come back. Michael tried to deny it at first, but then he broke down and confessed. He had been desperate, he said. He had been promised a safe place to stay by the raiders, but he had quickly realized that they were monsters. He had been looking for a way out ever since. Sarah and David didn't know what to believe. They didn't want to be fooled by Michael again, but they also didn't want to turn away someone who might genuinely be in need. In the end, they decided to give Michael a second chance. They offered to help him find a new community, one that was truly safe and supportive. They hoped that he would learn from his mistakes and become a valuable ally rather than a dangerous enemy. But even as they made this decision, Sarah and David couldn't shake the feeling of unease. They knew that the wasteland was full of danger, and they couldn't afford to trust anyone who might be a threat to their survival. They would have to remain vigilant, no matter what. Chapter 8. The Betrayal. Despite their best efforts to stay safe and protect their community, Sarah and David knew that danger was always lurking around every corner. They had learned to trust no one and to always be prepared for the worst. One day, as they were out on a supply run, they received a distress signal from one of the other survivors in their community. They rushed back to their base, only to find that it had been completely ransacked. Everything was gone. Their weapons, their supplies, even their vehicles. It was as if a tornado had come through and swept everything away. Sarah and David were devastated. They had worked so hard to build their community, and now it had all been taken away in an instant. They didn't know what to do or where to turn. As they started to investigate the scene, they found evidence that pointed to a group of raiders. It was the same group that Michael had been working for, the same group that had attacked them before. Sarah and David were furious. They couldn't believe that Michael had betrayed them once again. They had given him a chance, and he had used that opportunity to lead his raiding party right to their doorstep. But they didn't have time to dwell on their anger. They knew that they had to act fast if they wanted to take back what was rightfully theirs. Sarah and David rallied the other survivors and started to come up with a plan. They knew that they were outnumbered and outgunned, but they were determined to fight back and defend their community. They spent hours strategizing, poring over maps and blueprints, and gathering whatever weapons and supplies they had left. Finally, they were ready. They set out under cover of darkness, determined to catch the raiders off guard and take them by surprise. The battle was intense. It was like nothing Sarah and David had ever experienced before. The raiders were well organized and well armed, and they had no qualms about using brutal tactics to get what they wanted. But Sarah and David and their community fought with everything they had. They were outnumbered, but they were not outmatched. They used their knowledge of the terrain and their superior tactics to gain the upper hand. In the end, they emerged victorious. The raiders were defeated, and their community was safe once again. Sarah and David were exhausted but elated. They had proved to themselves and to the rest of the survivors that they were strong and capable leaders. But as they looked around at the destruction and devastation that the raiders had caused, they knew that they couldn't let their guard down. They would have to be even more vigilant from now on to ensure that their community would never be taken by surprise again. Chapter 9. The Reckoning. After the raiders' attack, Sarah and David knew that they needed to be extra cautious. They were unsure of who they could trust and knew that another attack could come at any moment. One day, while on a supply run, Sarah and David stumbled upon a group of survivors who were also trying to rebuild their community. The group was led by a man named Jack, who claimed to have valuable resources and knowledge that could be useful to Sarah and David's community. Sarah and David were skeptical, but they decided to hear Jack out. He explained that his group had managed to secure a large store of food and medical supplies, as well as a working vehicle that could be used for scouting and transportation. In exchange for their resources, Jack proposed a deal. He would join forces with Sarah and David's community and help them to rebuild and defend their community against future attacks. Sarah and David were hesitant to trust Jack, but they knew that they needed all the help they could get. They agreed to the deal, but kept a close eye on Jack and his group. For a while, everything seemed to be going well. Jack and his group proved to be valuable allies, and they worked together to fortify the community and gather supplies. But Sarah and David couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Jack seemed to be getting more and more powerful within the community, and they began to suspect that he had ulterior motives. Their suspicions were confirmed when they discovered that Jack had been hoarding resources and weapons for himself and his group. He had been planning to take over the community and leave Sarah and David's group at the mercy of the raiders. Sarah and David were furious. They had trusted Jack, and he had betrayed them just like Michael had. They knew that they couldn't let him get away with it. They called a meeting of the community and confronted Jack. He denied everything, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. In the end, Sarah and David banished Jack and his group from the community. They knew that it was a risky move, but they couldn't allow Jack to continue to threaten the safety and stability of their community. It was a difficult decision, but Sarah and David knew that they had to do what was best for their community. They were determined to keep fighting for their survival, no matter what challenges lay ahead. Chapter 10. A New Threat. With the banishment of Jack and his group, Sarah and David's community was finally able to breathe a little easier. They had successfully defended themselves against two major threats, and they were beginning to feel like maybe they had a chance at rebuilding a life in this post-apocalyptic world. But just as they were starting to let their guard down, a new threat emerged. It started with reports of strange sightings near the community. People were claiming to have seen a group of mutants lurking in the shadows, watching and waiting. At first, Sarah and David were skeptical. They had heard stories of mutants before, but they had never actually encountered any. But as the reports continued to come in, they began to realize that there was something to be worried about. They called a meeting of the community to discuss the situation, and it quickly became clear that everyone was scared. No one knew exactly what these mutants were capable of, but they knew that they needed to be prepared for the worst. Sarah and David took charge, organizing a team of scouts to try and gather more information about the mutants. They quickly discovered that the mutants were indeed real, and that they were dangerous. The mutants were incredibly fast and strong, with razor-sharp claws and teeth that could tear through flesh and bone. Sarah and David knew that they needed to act fast. They began fortifying the community's defenses, setting traps and building barriers to keep the mutants out. They also organized a team of fighters, equipping them with the best weapons and training them to be ready for anything. As the community prepared for the inevitable attack, Sarah and David couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. They had faced challenges before, but this felt different. This felt like a fight for their very survival. But they were determined to do whatever it took to protect their community. They knew that the road ahead would be difficult and dangerous, but they were ready to face it head-on. Chapter 11. The Mutant Attack. Despite their preparations, Sarah and David's community was caught off guard when the mutants finally attacked. It was a dark and stormy night when they first heard the sound of scratching at the gates. At first, they thought it might be just a stray animal, but as the scratching grew louder and more persistent, they knew that it was something far more sinister. Sarah and David rallied the fighters and stationed them at the front gate, ready to defend the community with their lives. They waited in tense silence as the scratching grew louder and louder, until finally, the gate burst open with a deafening roar. The mutants poured into the community like a flood, their glowing eyes and razor-sharp claws sending fear through the hearts of even the bravest fighters. The sound of battle filled the air as the fighters clashed with the mutants, their weapons flashing in the moonlight. Despite their best efforts, the mutants were relentless. They seemed to be everywhere at once, attacking from all angles and overwhelming the community's defenses. It was a brutal and bloody battle, with casualties on both sides. Sarah and David fought side by side, their weapons slashing through the mutant horde with deadly precision. But even they knew that it was only a matter of time before the mutants overwhelmed them completely. Just when it seemed like all hope was lost, a sudden explosion rocked the community. The mutants staggered back, disoriented, as a cloud of smoke and debris filled the air. Sarah and David looked around in confusion, trying to understand what had just happened. That's when they saw Jack, standing on the roof of a nearby building with a smoking grenade launcher in his hand. "Need a hand?" he shouted down to them with a grin. Sarah and David couldn't believe their eyes. After everything that had happened, they never thought they would see Jack again, let alone fighting on their side. With Jack's help, the fighters were finally able to gain the upper hand. They pushed the mutants back, driving them out of the community and into the night. When the dust finally settled, Sarah and David looked around at the damage that had been done. It was a devastating sight, with buildings burned and rubble everywhere. But they also knew that they had survived and that they were stronger for it. As they looked up at the starry sky above, Sarah and David couldn't help but wonder what other challenges lay ahead of them. But for now, they were content to rest and celebrate their victory, knowing that they had faced their fears and come out on top. Chapter 12. The Aftermath. In the aftermath of the mutant attack, Sarah and David knew that they had to act fast to secure their community and prevent any further attacks. They gathered the remaining fighters and set about fortifying the community's defenses. They patched up the damaged buildings and reinforced the gates and walls, knowing that they couldn't afford to let their guard down again. As they worked, Sarah and David couldn't help but think about the toll that the attack had taken on their community. Many of their friends and fellow fighters had been injured or killed, and the survivors were still reeling from the trauma of the battle. But even in the face of such adversity, Sarah and David remained determined to rebuild and move forward. They knew that they couldn't let the mutants or any other dangers of the post-apocalyptic world break their spirits or their resolve. Days turned into weeks, and eventually, the community began to recover. The wounded started to heal, and the fighters resumed their patrols, keeping a watchful eye out for any signs of trouble. During this time, Sarah and David also grew closer. They had been through so much together, and their shared experiences had deepened their bond. They spent long hours talking and sharing their hopes and dreams for the future. But even as they allowed themselves to hope, they knew that they couldn't let their guard down. The post-apocalyptic world was unforgiving, and danger lurked around every corner. As the weeks turned into months, Sarah and David continued to lead their community with strength and courage. They knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but they were determined to keep moving forward, one step at a time. Chapter 13. The Betrayal. As the community continued to rebuild and grow stronger, Sarah and David received a troubling message from a neighboring group of survivors. They were being threatened by a gang of raiders, and they needed help to defend themselves. Sarah and David knew that they couldn't turn their backs on their neighbors in need, so they gathered a team of fighters and set out to help them. They arrived just in time to help fend off a raid by the vicious gang, and the grateful survivors welcomed them with open arms. But as they settled into the community, Sarah and David began to sense that something was off. The leader of the community, a man named Jack, seemed overly eager to please them, and his behavior was suspicious. One night, as Sarah and David were discussing their next move with Jack, they were suddenly ambushed by his followers. They were outnumbered and outgunned, and they soon found themselves prisoners of Jack and his men. It was then that Jack revealed his true motives. He had never intended to ally with Sarah and David, but had instead been plotting to use their skills and resources to further his own agenda. He had been feeding information about their community to the raiders, hoping to weaken them and eventually take over their territory. Sarah and David were horrified by the betrayal, but they refused to give up without a fight. They used their wits and their skills to break free from their captors and launch a daring escape. As they fled into the night, Sarah and David knew that they had to warn their community about the impending attack. They raced back to their own community, determined to protect their friends and loved ones from the danger that lay ahead. Chapter 14. The Battle. Sarah and David returned to their community, exhausted and shaken from their escape. They quickly gathered the community's leaders and shared the information they had learned about Jack's betrayal and his alliance with the raiders. The community was stunned, but they knew that they had to act quickly to defend themselves. They began to prepare for the coming battle, fortifying their defenses and arming themselves for the fight ahead. The raiders soon arrived, led by Jack and his followers. They were heavily armed and determined to wipe out the community and take their resources. The battle was fierce and brutal, with both sides suffering heavy losses. Sarah and David fought side by side, using their skills and experience to turn the tide of the battle in their community's favor. As the sun began to rise on the aftermath of the battle, the community emerged victorious. Jack and his followers were either dead or captured, and the raiders had been driven off. But the victory came at a great cost. Many of the community's members had lost their lives, and the survivors were left to mourn their friends and loved ones. Sarah and David knew that they had played a crucial role in the victory, but they were also humbled by the sacrifices that had been made. They knew that they could never take their safety and security for granted, and that they would always be ready to defend their community against any threat that might come their way. Chapter 15. Rebuilding. After the battle, the community was left in shambles. Homes and buildings had been destroyed, and many members had lost everything they owned. But Sarah, David, and the other leaders knew that they had to start rebuilding, both physically and emotionally. They began by organizing the community and assessing the damage. They set up temporary shelters and provided food and water for those in need. They also worked to clear the debris and rebuild the damaged structures. Sarah and David played a crucial role in this rebuilding effort. They worked tirelessly to provide support and assistance to their fellow community members, using their skills and knowledge to help rebuild homes and infrastructure. As the days turned into weeks, the community slowly began to recover. New buildings were erected, crops were planted, and life began to return to a sense of normalcy. But the emotional wounds of the battle ran deep, and Sarah and David knew that it would take time for the community to fully heal. They worked to provide emotional support and counseling to those who needed it, and they encouraged the community to come together to support one another. Despite the challenges they faced, Sarah and David were heartened by the resilience and determination of their community. They knew that they had been through a great trial, but they also knew that they were stronger for it. As they looked out over the rebuilt community, Sarah and David felt a sense of pride and hope for the future. They knew that there would be more challenges ahead, but they were ready to face them together as a community. Chapter 16. New Threats. As the community continued to rebuild and recover, Sarah and David began to hear rumors of a new threat on the horizon. A group of raiders had been spotted in the area, targeting communities for resources and supplies. Sarah and David knew that they couldn't let their guard down, not after all they had been through. They immediately began to organize patrols and strengthen the community's defenses. At first, there were no signs of the raiders. But as the weeks went on, there were more and more reports of attacks and raids in the surrounding area. Sarah and David knew that they needed to act fast. They called a meeting of the community leaders and presented a plan to fortify the community and prepare for an attack. The leaders agreed, and they all worked together to build walls, dig trenches, and set up watchtowers. Sarah and David also organized training sessions for the community members, teaching them how to defend themselves and the community. They knew that they couldn't rely solely on a few skilled fighters to protect the community. Everyone needed to be able to contribute to the defense effort. The preparations paid off when the raiders finally arrived. They came in the middle of the night, hoping to catch the community off guard. But the community was ready for them. The raiders were met with a hail of arrows and bullets, and they quickly realized that they had underestimated the strength of the community. They tried to breach the walls, but they were no match for the defenders. In the end, the raiders retreated, defeated and humiliated. Sarah and David looked out over the community, proud of what they had accomplished together. They knew that there would always be new threats and challenges, but they were confident that they could face them as long as they stood together. Chapter 17. A New Arrival. A few weeks after the raiders were repelled, a stranger arrived at the community. He was a tall, wiry man with a thick beard and piercing blue eyes. He introduced himself as John and said that he was looking for a place to stay. Sarah and David were cautious at first, but John seemed harmless enough. He said that he had been traveling alone for months and had been forced to scavenge for food and shelter. He seemed grateful for the community's hospitality and quickly became a valued member of the community. John was skilled in many areas, including carpentry and hunting. He helped the community repair buildings and construct new ones. He also shared his hunting knowledge and helped the community improve their food production. As time passed, Sarah and David began to trust John more and more. They even started to share some of the community's secrets with him, including the location of their hidden caches of supplies. But then, one day, Sarah and David discovered that John had been stealing from the community. He had taken food, weapons, and other supplies from the hidden caches and had been secretly hoarding them for himself. Sarah and David were furious. They had trusted John, and he had betrayed that trust. They called a meeting of the community leaders and presented the evidence against John. The community was shocked and angry, and they demanded that John be expelled. Sarah and David knew that they couldn't ignore the community's wishes, but they also knew that they couldn't simply turn John out into the wilderness. They decided to offer him a choice. He could leave the community and try to survive on his own, or he could stay and face punishment for his theft. To their surprise, John chose the punishment. He said that he wanted to make things right and earn back the community's trust. Sarah and David were impressed by his determination, and they agreed to let him stay. John worked hard to make amends. He helped the community with extra tasks and even took on extra patrols to keep the community safe. Over time, he regained the community's trust and became an integral part of their survival effort. Chapter 18. The Great Storm. The community had been enjoying a period of relative calm and prosperity, but that all changed when a great storm hit. It was unlike anything they had ever seen before, with fierce winds and torrential rain that lasted for days. The community's buildings were battered by the winds, and many of them were damaged or destroyed. The rain flooded the streets, and the community's fields were submerged. The crops were ruined, and the community's food supply was in danger. Sarah and David knew that they had to act fast. They organized the community to repair the damaged buildings and clear the streets. They also put together a team to salvage what they could from the flooded fields and start replanting. It was hard work, but the community pulled together and made progress. However, their efforts were threatened by the arrival of a group of raiders who took advantage of the chaos to try to take over the community. Sarah and David knew that they couldn't fight off the raiders on their own, so they sent out a call for help to the other nearby communities. They hoped that they would be able to band together and fight off the raiders. To their relief, the other communities answered their call for help. They sent reinforcements to help defend the community, and together they fought off the raiders. The community was saved, but the storm had left them vulnerable. Sarah and David knew that they had to start planning for the future. They realized that they couldn't rely on their crops alone for survival and began looking for other sources of food. They also started to build stronger, more secure buildings to withstand future storms. The storm had been a difficult time for the community, but it had also taught them important lessons about preparedness and resilience. They knew that they couldn't predict what the future would bring, but they were determined to be ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Chapter 19. The Long Winter. The community had managed to survive the storm, but they were not prepared for what came next. A long and brutal winter descended upon them, with snow and ice covering the ground for months on end. The community's food supplies had been damaged by the storm, and they were struggling to keep everyone fed. The harsh winter made it even harder, and many people were forced to go hungry. Sarah and David knew that they had to act quickly. They organized a team to hunt for game in the nearby forests, and they sent out scouts to look for other sources of food. They also rationed what little food they had left, trying to make it last as long as possible. Despite their best efforts, the community was still struggling. People were getting sick from malnutrition and exposure to the cold, and morale was at an all-time low. Sarah and David knew that they needed a miracle to save the community, and that's when it came. A group of travelers stumbled upon the community one day, seeking shelter from the harsh winter. They were a diverse group of people, with different skills and resources. Some were hunters, some were farmers, and some were carpenters. Sarah and David saw an opportunity. They invited the travelers to stay in the community and work together to survive the winter. The travelers agreed, and they quickly got to work. The hunters brought in fresh game, the farmers helped to replant the damaged fields, and the carpenters built new and stronger buildings to withstand the cold. Slowly but surely, the community began to recover. The long winter was still hard, but with the help of the travelers, they were able to make it through. When the spring finally arrived, the community was stronger than ever before. They had survived the storm and the winter, and they had learned important lessons about resilience and cooperation. Sarah and David knew that the community still faced many challenges in the future, but they were confident that together, they could overcome anything. Chapter 20. The Future. Ahead. As the community emerged from the long winter, they knew that they had come a long way. They had faced incredible challenges and overcome them, thanks to the leadership of Sarah and David and the support of their fellow community members. But there was still work to be done. The community needed to continue to grow and evolve to adapt to the changing world around them. Sarah and David knew that they couldn't do it alone. They needed to build a strong, sustainable community that could thrive for generations to come. They began by organizing a council of leaders representing different aspects of the community to work together to make important decisions and plan for the future. They also reached out to neighboring communities, forging alliances and partnerships that could help them to share resources and work together in times of need. And they continued to focus on education and training, ensuring that the next generation of community members would be well equipped to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As time passed, the community continued to grow and thrive. New families moved in, businesses were established, and the community became a hub of innovation and progress. But Sarah and David never forgot the lessons they had learned in the early days of the community, when they had faced incredible challenges and come together to overcome them. They knew that the future was never certain, and that the community would face many more challenges in the years to come. But they were confident that, together, they could face anything. And as they looked out at the thriving, resilient community they had built, they knew that their efforts had been worth it. For they had created a place where people could come together, support each other, and thrive in the face of adversity.